Thank you, Tim. So in the next seconds, I'll be presenting my thesis that describes the demographic evolution of the Gorgonian populations of Luiz Saldanha Marine Park over the last 12 years. So Gorgonians are a group of cnidarians often characterized as ecosystem engineers, as they can create essential habitat for other species, support the food webs, and as they also can provide important ecological services by participating in natural processes like the biogeochemical cycles. So these organisms, the presence of these organisms is regulated by a set of selective factors, as well as the natural and the anthropogenic pressures present in the system. The selective factors vary between species, as well as the resilience of each species to the external conditions. Nevertheless, some populations have already shown to be quite sensitive to the environmental changes and to the human impacts, as is the case of the Mediterranean Gorgonians, where severe losses were recorded inside marine protected areas due to the temperature rises and the recreational activities practiced. Although it had also been proved that a well-implemented and a well-managed MPA, along with the usage of other mitigation action, can actually minimize the human impacts in the local and promote the recovery of the populations. In Portugal, Luiz Saldanha Marine Park is located in the south coast of Setubal Peninsula, and in this marine protected area, the Gorgonian populations are well spread and present in all the types of protected areas, although according to the present legislation, none of the species found here is under a regime of protection. Only the Natura 2000 network provides guidelines for the protection and preservation of their habitat. So the study objective is in the first place the creation of a baseline that would allow the present characterization of the Gorgonian populations and that can be used as reference for future studies. And in the second place is also to establish a comparison between data gathered in 2007 and 2019 to evaluate the evolution of the demography and the disturbance levels in this MPA. So from this comparison is expected to be observed an overall positive evolution of the demography of the populations, along with a reduction of the disturbance levels. And additionally, is also expected from this demography evolution and this reduction of the disturbance to follow a pattern according to the level of protection. So regarding the MPA zonation, there are several restrictions, but the ones that directly affect the benthic communities are, for example, the prohibition of the trawling techniques, dredging, or the discharge of untreated residual waters and debris. More specifically, the complementary protected areas are the only areas that allow for commercial fishing in this MPA, and it can only be practiced beyond the quarter of a nautical mile, which is defined here by the dark green dashed line. In the partial protection, non-commercial fishing is also allowed beyond the 200 meters from the coastline, which is represented from the light green dashed line, here with the use of straps and line fishing guards. Also, the watercrafts are allowed to navigate in the area, although they can only set anchor or moor beyond the quarter of a nautical mile from the coastline. And finally, in the total protected area, the human presence is only allowed beyond the quarter of a nautical mile from the coastline, and this area can only be used as harmless passage. So, aligning the history of the park with the assessments performed over the Gorgonian populations, it all started in 1976 with the creation of a habitat natural park that would be extended to the marine grounds in 1998 with the creation of Luiz Saldanha Marine Park. Although only in 2005, the gradual implementation process of this MPA started and will last 4 years. Meanwhile, in 2007, Sandra Rodrigues performed the first assessment to the Gorgonian populations inside this marine protected area. And here it is, 2009 marked the end of the implementation process. In 2011, a second and smaller assessment was made by an IMBRSea student, Helena Alvarez. And in 2019, last year, CCMAR carried a monitoring action in the IMBRSea program. So along the 38 kilometers of the marine protected area, there are is present a wide spectrum of environmental conditions related with bottom composition and the exposure to the wave and current action. And there is also a seasonal effect over the water temperature and over the intensity and frequency of the upwelling and algae bloom effects. There is stronger in the summer between the months of June and August. And additionally, there is also an anticyclonic circulation in the Setubal Bay that elongates the time residency of warm water pools and consequently stabilizes the temperature at higher levels for longer periods. So in the data collection, here in this map, we have all the locations accessed. A table with exact locations with the coordinates is present at the end of this presentation. So in each of these locations, a team of divers would perform several transects with 1 meter of width, and the length of the transects would vary due to the diving constrictions. And here I want to highlight that Pedra Bonita, the location number 9, was only accessed in 2019. So in all the transects performed, a total of 4 species were found. Although as Eunicella labiata and Eunicella volcosa are difficult to distinguish underwater, they were both classified as Eunicella sp, or ESP, as we can see here in this slide. Also, due to the diverse error or to a high percentage of necrosis or coverage of epiphytes, some of the Gorgonians could not be identified to the species and were for this reason classified as non-identified or NA. The demography and the disturbance proxies, or the parameters chosen to characterize the demography and the disturbance levels, were chosen according to the literature and following the methodologies used by other authors that performed similar studies. Regarding the statistical analysis, all the statistical tests were performed in RStudio with the use of GLMs, analysis of variance, and post-hoc tests. Unfortunately, due to the different environmental conditions, to the different periods in which the data collections took place, and in some different methodologies between the campaigns of 2007 and 2019, some comparisons could not be accomplished. Now, as for the results, and starting with the spatial distribution and abundance, the overall abundance increased from 2007 to 2019. Leptogorgia sarmentosa was always the most abundant species, followed by Eunicella sp, although in the location of Arcangel and Pedra de Milu, Eunicella sp actually obtained elevated more records than Leptogorgia sarmentosa. And considering the elevated number of records, the same was close to happen in Jardim dos Gorgonians. Here, when we distributed the records along the protected areas, we can see that the complementary protection number 2, that is only represented by 1 location, is in fact have a good proportion of records when comparing to partial protected and total protected areas. So, although the density had increased, the abundance had increased, the overall density decreased by 30%. This result was not significant when all the species and all the sites were tested together. On the other hand, when the sites were tested separately, Pedra do Meio, Baleeira, and Três Marias were actually the locations that where significant differences were detected. And here, Jardim das Gorgonias and the Risco were the only locations that show an increment in the density, although it was not significant. Here, when displaying the density results by the area, it's also normal that only the complementary protection and the partially protection number 3 display significant changes, because both these areas are only represented by 1 location, which corresponds to the locations mentioned previously. So in the canopy area, a positive change, and the average canopy area increased by 35%. This value was significant when all the species and all the locations were tested together. And for this parameter, only Âncora and the Três Marias, these were the only locations that didn't show a significant increment of the canopy height. And here we can see actually that the partial protected area number 1 and the number 2 are the areas that hold the records for the bigger Gorgonians. And once again, partial protected area number 3, which is represented only by Três Marias, didn't show a significant change. The canopy area, although it's a better indicator than the canopy height, it was only measured in 2019. So I want to highlight the different levels of canopy area produced by the species, which is also related with the number of colonies found by each species. And here the results are pretty much consistent with the canopy area, with the Ercanzil and Pedra de Milu holding the bigger Gorgonians, and the same here in the partially protected area number 1 and number 2 that hold the biggest records. So as for the necrosis and the epiphytes, in 2007, well, in 2007, only 7 Gorgonians were recorded with necrosis, which possibly doesn't correspond to a real value. So this parameter was not really evaluated. And the presence of epiphytes, the description of the epiphytes is only valid for the data collection periods between August and December, as was produced after the upwelling and algae bloom peaks. So in this parameter, 34% of the Gorgonians were affected by epiphytes, with an average percentage cover of 36%. And here there were some significant differences between the areas in the same year. And we can see that the partially protected area number 2 was the one that was most affected. And also to highlight that in this case, and by this comparison, the complementary area number 2 achieved a better status than the partially protected area number 1. So regarding also the epiphytes in 2009, and this time this description is only valid between the months of June and July. This time the levels rise quite a bit. So in this time, 54% of the Gorgonians were affected by epiphytes, and the average percentage was similar to the different seasonal period. So once again, the partial protected area number 2 was the most affected area, and this time the partial protected area number 3 was the least affected. Although it's still possible to observe significant differences between the partial protected area number 2 and the complementary protected area number 2. As for the necrosis, this time the results were quite reliable, and only 13.3% of the Gorgonians were affected by necrosis, although the results of the necrosis followed pretty much the same pattern as the epiphytes due to the strong correlation between these two factors, as 97% of the Gorgonians that showed necrosis also showed a coverage of epiphytes. And so for this reason, once again, there are significant differences between some areas. So to summarize and discuss about the hypothesis formulated, there was an increment of the abundance and the average canopy area, although a decrease in the density, and the recruitment was low, and it was not specified before because in the entire transacts performed, only 3 recruits were counted. And as for the disturbance levels, well, the necrosis presents an acceptable value, although the numbers presented by the epiphytes are quite severe, and for this reason they deserve a negative status. And also regarding the anthropogenic pressure, only 3 Gorgonians were found with remainings of fishing gear. So for this reason, due to the output of the results, both of the hypotheses are rejected. At no point there was a clear evidence of a general improvement of the demographic status of the populations, especially because the density have decreased, and there was also not possible to observe an effect of the increasing level of protection over the measured parameters. So possible explanations, well, for the increase in the abundance are the better surveying conditions, as the CCMR in 2019 had its own boats and free teams of divers. And so in 2019, more area was covered, and the density can pretty much be explained by natural or anthropogenic impacts, although the data that was collected don't allow to specify what was the real cause. And well, the average canopy height, on the contrary, suggests there is no impacts from recreational activities, as it had increased, and suggests that the Gorgonians are not getting broken. The recruitment was low and may be explained by the drop in density, so the reduction of the recruitment capability of the population. And unfortunately, for these long-term assessments, it's also difficult to estimate or quantify the anthropogenic and the natural pressures, which makes it difficult to identify all the problems present in the MPA. So here the same for the disturbance parameters, and here the only difference between the epiphytes observed in 2007 and 2009 is related with the season in which the data collection took place. So for future studies and to be possible to identify all the possible causes that disturb the demography of the population, it will be important to add new methodologies and to study the selective parameters of the inside of the MPA. And by adding new methodologies, I suggest the use of stationary transects, as they allow for a better characterization of the demography of the population. Nonetheless, the present study provides an important baseline that gathers information from 2007 and 2019, and that can be used for future comparisons. And this study is also the first study made to evaluate the effects of an MPA over the Gorgonian populations in Portugal, and it is actually one of the few studies that can gather two data sets with 12 years of time interval. So regarding the MPA management plan, designation quite allow for a good balance between the conservation and the regional culture and economy. Although when accessing the MPA, it was not really visible the barriers, defining the boundaries between the different types of protected areas. So this factor can actually condition the use of the MPA by the tourists that don't know the area and for this reason don't comply with the limitations for anchoring or mooring or fishing. And also there is a need for the park to improve the surveilling conditions, as only 2 guards are responsible to surveil the entire MPA with 53 kilometers squares of area and 38 kilometers of coast. So as for the possible trends, well, the literature suggests that the water temperature in the Portuguese coastal waters is increasing, and this increasing of temperatures is also known to lead to outbreaks of Gorgonian disease, which can increase the number of Gorgonians affected by necrosis, and also to increase the upwelling and algae bloom events, which will then increase the infected by epiphytes. Also, the anticyclonic circulation can also provide cumulative effects, as the rising temperatures can also stay.
Maybe good to round up in terms of timing. Sorry to disturb.
Is the last slide. The anti-circulation can actually increase the Gorgonians to a prolongated thermal stress, which will then lead to a continuation of or a trend that the populations will continue to decline. Although inside the MPA, there is also some repopulation programs running at the moment. Still, there is no information of the reliability of these programs and if the Gorgonians will lead to environmental conditions. So the natural populations must be preserved to preserve also this genetic pool for the species present and also to preserve the local biodiversity. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. Time for